Okay, so we're back again, and as you can see, we got some new faces with us. Of course, Alexander is back again, and on your lower left-hand corner, you've got John Hancock, and the bottom right-hand corner, we got Clay Miller. So good to have you all with us. And if you have a Bible, we're going to be looking at Psalm 139. And we decided to break this down into like 4 parts, and we're going to go through it a little bit at a time. So if you can join us and read with us, this is a very meaningful psalm to a lot of people. Some people say it's even their favorite song. It's definitely in my top 10, but it should be a really comforting psalm. As we're recording this, things are starting to open up with states each kind of cautiously letting people meet again in restaurants and worship again and worship services, and that's wonderful. But we all know that this whole thing is not over, and there's still going to be a long process, not just of recovering from the health crisis, but the economic crisis. And so, psalms like this should be very practical and helpful to us moving forward. So this psalm especially has brought a lot of comfort to me personally, and I know to a lot of others as well. So let's start out just by reading 1 through 6, and I'll start out. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. So this is just talking about how God knows us. He knows everything about us. He knows us when we go to sleep. He knows us when we get up and go to work or go to school. And knowing there is not just like knowing who we are or where we are. It's more like a very intimate kind of knowledge that he has of us, where kind of like, if you're married, I'm talking to 3 single guys here, but if you're married, you know your spouse, and Adrian can anticipate what I'm going to say. She knows what I'm going to say before I say it, and that's what is said about God here, is before a word is on my tongue, you know it all together. So he knows me better than Adrian knows me. He knows me better than I know myself. And that's a comfort, because, when you're going through a hard time, what you want is someone who can relate to you, who understands you and knows you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why prayer is such a comfort to us, is we're talking to someone who knows us and understands us. So your general impressions, thoughts on verses 1 through 6.
I really like verse 6, where it talks about knowledge that's too high for me. And that's something I constantly struggle with is the idea of pride. And it's stuff like this, meditation on this, where I realize I'm a young kid. I don't have it all together, but my God has it all together. And that's why I can rely on him, especially in hard times, because he knows what's going on and how to fix it. So
yeah, it definitely does keep you from pride to know. He knows me, but there's no way I could know him.
Mm-hmm.
He's so much greater than I
am. Reminds me of, Jesus really displayed this as well in the earth. And when he's talking to the Samaritan woman, he's telling her all the things that she did. She recognizes that too. And she goes and tells people, this man told me everything that I've ever done. And, I've never met him before. I don't know him.
Yeah, and that kind of revealed to her that he had to be the Messiah. Or she was, saying, could this be the one? But, she definitely was made a believer out of just that kind of intimate knowledge. Who could know that except God? Yeah. Clay, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing I see out of this is just God's care for the individual. I mean, verse 3 says, you comprehend my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways, for there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. I think sometimes it's easy for us to get caught up in well, God doesn't see me. I'm just one person. But, David here says that he knows when we sit down, the words we say. And so I think it's just important to remember that God has the power to know everything about us, the individual, and that he's still watching over us.
Yeah, and he not only has the power to know, but he has the desire to know. I think that's the idea of "you have searched me." It's like God is studying us. I know when I was a kid, and this has not really changed, but when I was a kid and I would come home from school, first question my mom would ask me is, "How was your day?" And of course, my standard, answer as a kid was, "Okay." It's like, and that's all I wanted to say. But she wasn't satisfied with that. She wanted to dig deeper and find out more, information, and that really has not changed. I'm 48 years old, and still my mom is not satisfied with, "Yeah, I'm okay." She wants to dig and find out what's going on in my life because she loves me, and that's the way God is. He's not just passively up in heaven aware of everything going on, but kind of unconcerned and aloof and indifferent. He's really concerned. And there's only so many people you have like that in your life, where that if you were to pick up your phone and you were to call them, they would not only answer, but they would answer and be really interested in what you have to say, and like know you well enough to understand why you're so upset by what you're going through. And I think that's why this was on David's thoughts as he was, thinking about God's knowledge of him, how much God cared about him. All right, so who did we say was going to do 7 through 12?
That was me.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Verse 7. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you.
So, John, what do you see here? What stands out to you in this section?
The overall power of God. He is everywhere and he rules over everything. I really like that verse 11. He's pointing out that it is really dark to him. He can't see anything. You think about, if like you're in a cave or something, the darkness is so thick. You put your hand right in front of you and you have no idea where it is. But he makes the remark in verse 12 that it's not dark at all to God. God is not. He's not contained by the physical bounds that we have by our earth.
Yeah, and the way I've looked at verse 11 and 12, I know I'm jumping in before others can comment, is that this darkness is perhaps metaphorical. Like this may have come at a time in David's life where he's being chased by Saul, or he's being, run out of Jerusalem by Absalom. And he's got all these enemies, and just the darkness is covering over him. But in the midst of all, and this may be like literal, like, David was literally in a cave, while Saul was chasing him. But in that cave, nobody else knew where David was, but God did. And perhaps nobody else understood how bad David was being treated by Saul, or how badly he was being betrayed by his own son. And people were, praising Absalom and following him and just kind of forgetting about David. God didn't forget about him, and God knew that David was right. Mm-hmm. And so like there's no fear of the dark, right? There's no fear of evil and wickedness, as bad as it might get, because we know that God is greater than the darkness. That's just my thoughts. I do love 11 and 12, and I think 11 and 12 help us to understand some more difficult parts of the psalm later, where he curses the wicked and stuff. But anyway, so somebody else on 7 through 12. What do you see? What do you like?
So I actually see this both ways here. And he kind of hints at it in verse 8. If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. And it makes me think of the verse that ends Ecclesiastes when it said God will bring every work into judgment, every secret thing, whether good or evil. And so I think, we can take that as if we're good, then God is with us and sees us and is going to help us. But at the same time, you can't hide from God. You can't hide your actions from God. And if you're sinful, God's going to know that too. And so I think it kind of goes both ways here.
Yeah, so it's like this part of the psalm can either be a comfort to you or it can be terrifying. It's terrifying if you're not doing what God wants. The fact that God knows everything about us and knows where we are. But it's comforting if you're abiding in God's will. And that's what David said to Saul. The Lord's going to judge between me and you. I'm not going to raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. But the Lord knows who is right here. And in the end, God is going to make things right. And so, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And I just, night for us is a natural, it's just kind of like our fear embodied. It's 12-hour period of our day where we can't see anything. We lose our direction, our sight. So just to know that even in the midst of that, God can come into it and brighten it, that expels the fear for us. And that's a comfort to me. So that's, I see it more on the comfort side about who God is and his nature.
Yeah.
I think,
yeah, to your point, Alexander, verse 10 says, well, in verse 9, if I take the wings of the morning, that would be like, so 8 is like vertical, going from heaven to Sheol. And then verse 9 would be like the wings of the morning, the sun rises in the east, and then it sets in the uttermost parts of the sea. To the west would be the sea, the great sea. And so anyway I go, verse 10, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. And so David is definitely feeling comforted by God's presence, not terrified by it.
Yeah.
Do you have something?
Well,
John?
and also in verse 7, 7 and 8 really, he's talking about, trying to run away from God. You can't do it. And like you said, David, it almost is one of those parts of the psalm that could be really scary, but David is not really thinking about it that way as he's talking about these. Now, for some people, it would be, in Isaiah, when Isaiah is talking about the judgments that would come on the nations, he said they're going to try to hide in caves and under the rocks to try to get away from God, but they're not going to be able to do that. Jonah, he tries to flee from God, but he can't do that. But this is very much David seeing it in a positive way, that no matter where he goes, God is always going to be there with him. As long as he's trying to be with God, God is going to take care of him.
Yeah. Alexander, it looked like you were about to say something else.
No, I was just asking you, John, if he had something to say.
Oh, okay. All right. So, Clay, if you would read verse 13 through 18.
All right. For you formed my inward parts, you covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God! How great is the sum of them! If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with you.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on here. What stands out to you?
Just in the first couple of verses, I mean, we can just really see that we are made in God's image, and God has a definite hand in that. And if that isn't a reason to value, a child's life, I don't know what is, because, verse 14 says, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. And that phrase, my soul knows very well, to me almost says that, we're connected through that soul, that, that's how we understand God. And then just going on, God has a plan for me. And once again, caring for the individual, he has days set out for me. And no matter who you are, you can work for God and you can know God. And then, he kind of ends talking about how precious God is to him.
Yeah. but you're referring there to verse 16.
Right.
In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, John, Alexander, you have any thoughts on this section?
I enjoy just this concept of him knitting you together in your mother's womb. And to us, there's so many babies that have been born. So to us, it's not miraculous. It's kind of something that happens. It's a natural occurrence.
Yeah.
But David acknowledges that God is, intimate with his child. Like he has this care and this connection with his child because he's building it inside the mother's womb. So it shows that even when a child comes out, not exactly the way that we want it to, that we consider normal, God still has a loving care for it, that he has created you with a purpose. And that's something that I admire and love about the God we serve.
And God doesn't make any mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good.
So this is this part is very much a very small personal level of comfort for us, but I think you can also step back and see it in the bigger picture that God is doing this for each individual child, for each person who is ever born, ever living. And just to think about it on that scale, we can't really get our heads around it because so many people are alive right now and so many people have ever lived. For God to do that for everyone is just incredible to think about.
Yeah. So there's a couple of verses here, or a couple of thoughts that seem to be implying a very, very intimate knowledge that God has of us. Where he says in verse 13, you form my inward parts. That's like the bowels. And that sounds kind of gross to us, but to the ancients, the bowels was like the seat of emotions and really the center of the person. That's why when they would offer sacrifices, they would offer, the liver and all those kidneys and stuff like that. That was considered to be like the most precious, most important parts of a being, of an animal or a person. And so the most intimate parts of my being, not just my physical organs, but of who I am. And to your point, Alexander, of knitting me together, it's like not just the DNA and the physical aspects, but like everything about my personality and my makeup. God made me. And then in verse 15, my frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret. I think the idea is that even before I came out of the womb, God was working on me and knew me. And why that would be a comfort to David, and we've already said this, is because there's just a real deep understanding of me. I think the reason why we're not as vulnerable as we need to be when we talk to others about our problems is we think, well, they're just not going to understand. They don't know me, and so they're going to judge me or they're not going to understand me. And so I'm just going to bottle all these emotions and feelings up inside. We don't have to do that with God. Nobody understands us better than the one who made us, and another thing I love in verse 16, in your book were written, every one of them. This is the book of remembrance that's referred to earlier in the Psalms. I forget which Psalm, but it's also mentioned in Malachi 3, where it's like God knows what's happening in our life and it's being written down. But here it says, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. And that's, you can get into some deep theological discussions of God's foreknowledge of specific things in our life. I think the point David is making here is that there's nothing that happens in our life that shocks God. The beginning of March, we were at Anna's wedding, my daughter's wedding, right? And I had heard of the coronavirus, but it wasn't really on my radar. I was hugging people and shaking hands, and we were in this big group of people. We weren't even thinking about this virus, but God knew exactly what was going to happen. And we were all shocked the next week when everything fell apart and things start shutting down and our world just gets turned upside down. But when we went to pray to God and asking for God's help, God wasn't up in heaven saying, Well, I didn't see that coming. I didn't see that happening. And that's the way it is with everything, every detail in my life. God knows it before it even happens. And that should be a comfort to me. So like from beginning to end, before I was even a thought on my parents' mind, before, as I was being formed in my mother's womb, to the day that I die, God knows it all from the beginning to the end, which is really cool. All right, so Alexander, by the way, volunteered to cover verses 19 through 22. So go ahead, Alexander, if you would like to read that and give us your thoughts on what David is praying here. And there's two prayers, by the way, in this prayer, and that's in verses 19 through 22, and then 23 and 24. So just read down to verse 22, Alexander.
Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a complete hatred. I count them my enemies.
Okay, so this is the portion of Psalm 139 that you're most likely not going to see posted up on someone's wall. Beautiful script. I mean, there's a lot of other verses that are very well known in Psalm 139, not these so much. So what is going on here, Alexander?
Yeah, so like when I originally I preached a sermon on this, and it was like, it got to this part and it's like, this isn't the part I like. Like this is not the good part. But the more I've come to see it, it's David reflecting this love for God that overwhelms him to the point of he can't stand evil anymore. That the people who stand for evil and oppression and injustice, those are the ones that he can't stand, just as God can't stand those who practice these things. So the kind of rage that we feel when we see unjust practices on any sort of level, there's plenty of it in our world. So anytime you see those things happening, that should frustrate us. It does. And there's a reason for that, because God has implanted in us something that teaches us that something is just and something is unjust. So David is saying, God, I am acting upon, these people who hate the poor and mistreat women and mistreat X and Y. I count them as my enemies because they have refused what your will is. And I think that should be our attitude. It's hard for us. Like, we don't like this language. It's kind of, maybe it's just our postmodern society, but we should have a rage and a frustration when things that happen that are unjust.
Well, and they don't just hate the poor and the marginalized, but they hate God.
Mm-hmm.
You really can't separate those two things, right? If you hate the creation, you hate the creator.
Yeah.
But that's the reason why David is feeling this intense hatred toward them, is because they're rebelling against God.
Mm-hmm.
So John, Clay, any thoughts on this? It's a disturbing part of the psalm, and it almost doesn't sound like it fits. Yeah, Clay.
I was saying John could go.
Oh, I don't have anything else than other than what Newman said, that this hate, maybe, I don't know if hate is the best translation for us. I think that it is just a relation of, these people have rejected God, have made God their enemy. So God, they are going to be my enemy as well. I'm going to be on your side in this fight.
Yeah, and one thing, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
One thing I like to point out on this is everything he says, it's not so much that they are fighting David and they are hurting David. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you and loathe those who rise up against you? And so it is very much directed toward God. And it's a passion for God that's fueling this prayer against the wicked.
This subject is something that I really think that we struggle with as humans and as Christians, just because it seems like we've gotten to a point where we don't like to offend anyone, and we're so scared to offend other people. And I think sometimes we forget that, God hates sin. He doesn't hate people. He hates sin. And so therefore we should hate sin too. And I think that's what David's saying here, is that he doesn't just hate these people for no reason. He hates their sin. And so sometimes it's okay to offend people if they're not doing what the Lord wants them to do, or if they're not abiding by the Lord's law. And that verse at the end that says, I hate them with perfect hatred, it's almost like this hatred is deserved, or he counts them as his enemies because they deserve it. And so I think that's a lesson for us, is that we need to stand up for the Lord. Like he was saying, Alexander was saying, David loves him so much, he's standing up for him. And so we need to do that too, whether it makes us unpopular with the world or not.
Yeah.
And it's not a personal vendetta, as kind of you were putting. It's this is what you have ordained, and they're rejecting it. They're standing against it. So I'm going to stand with you. So I totally agree.
Well, and the other thing to remember here, we need to balance this first prayer with the second prayer. So verse 23, and I'll just finish it out. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now it's interesting, a couple of things here. He begins the psalm, you have searched me and known me. And then he ends the psalm with the prayer for God to do that. So he's been confessing God's intimate knowledge of him from the day he was born, or before he was born, to the day of his death. But then he closes the prayer not only with judge the wicked, but also search me and my heart. In other words, if I am doing anything against you, and make this kind of a practical. So like, how do we pray Psalm 139, the end of it? How do we incorporate these prayers? Well, one way is to pray, as we have enemies who are coming against us and the darkness is covering in on us, to pray, God, make it right. Here's this person who is saying malicious things against you, but really, against me, but really they're saying them against you, because I'm standing for what's right. I'm trying to do what's right. And here's this person who's really blaspheming your name by coming at me. But I could be wrong, right? There could be something in me that is not right. I could be the problem. And so help me to know where my faults are so that I can honor you and your name. So I think that David is making it clear that this, as Alexander said, this is not just vindicate me. This is more vindicate yourself and make sure that I am on track with doing what's right.
So I think David, he has this acknowledgement that he has donated just as much sin to the world as anybody else.
Yeah.
I need your help just as much as anyone else. So make sure that I'm staying in the right too. And that's, as you were saying, it's a great attitude for us to have, to acknowledge that we are just as sinful and we rebel against God just as much. We need be relying on his grace, and we need to ask him to look at us and pray that we're in the right.
Amen.
So I think another point of application for prayers is, I think sometimes we can either oversimplify things or try to make things overly intricate. David here is telling God things that God already knows, but David is just trying to acknowledge that this is what he wants. And I don't think that we should shy away from that. We don't have to leave things out of our prayers just because, God already knows that. We don't have to try to put it in really intricate terms. Just say what's on your mind and what's on your heart. And that's what David is doing here.
Well said. Why hide something from God that he already knows? But the benefit is for us. We're not telling God anything, but there is a tremendous practical benefit in, first of all, unloading the burden that we feel in our heart, but then working through thinking about a solution and praying, God, just help me to know. I don't know what's wrong in my life, what I need to correct, but help me search my heart.
Yeah, I like that David ends with this thought, because it seems like he recognizes that at the end of the day, the most important thing is his relationship with God. That's his responsibility, and that's what he needs to make sure is right. You know, he can pray for all these other people and pray for God to take vengeance on them, but he can't control that. But what he can control is his relationship with God. And I think that's something we need to be praying about and keeping in our minds, is that we're not fallible, like Alexander said. And so we need to ask God to help us keep that good relationship with him.
Mm-hmm.
Amen. So any final thoughts anybody has? Again, I hope that these videos have been helpful to you. I know this has been good for me. And if you have a psalm that you would like for us to cover next week, I think we're going to continue doing this, at least in the short term, for a while. So please share that. Or if you just have a question or a comment that you would like to leave. And of course, if there's any way that we can help you personally, you can direct message us and we can at least pray with you or listen to you, whatever you're struggling with, and try to help you in some way spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you guys for doing this with us, and hopefully
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, hopefully have you and John and Clay on with us again, and Alexander and me will be back next week, maybe with somebody else, but we'll do this again. So hope everyone has a good day, and we'll sign out.
Yeah.